This is an incredibly important piece of legislation for adopted people. It provides them unconditional access to their birth certificates, a right which has been denied to them by successive governments and civil servants for decades. I'd also like to thank Deputies Connolly and Pringle and their teams for putting forward this legislation and prioritising it. Birth registrations have been public records in Ireland since 1864. For over 150 years, it has always been possible for members of the public to view the register of births and obtain copies of birth certificates. However, outrageously, this right has been denied to adopted people by state services and private interests in defence of a system that continues to marginalise and stigmatise them. Not only is the state stance morally wrong, it is a contravention of our obligations under international human rights law. Adopted people and many others rightly point out that access to a birth cert is the bare minimum of the right to identity, that is a fundamental document to who they are as individuals, continues to be denied to them is absolutely disgraceful. This bill provides a very clear and humane response that will enable people who have been treated with hostility and disdain by government agencies for seeking the most basic information about themselves. As part of the pre-legislative scrutiny of the government's Birth Information and Tracing Bill, the Committee on Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth have had numerous submissions from individuals and groups deeply impacted by this denial of the right to access of their own birth cert. Susan Lowen and Mary Steed of the Adoption Rights Alliance explained that many of them have died in the decades of inaction on the state's part to recognise their rights as Irish citizens and adopted people. This inaction has led to serious human rights abuses and ongoing discrimination. Marie Ryan O'Brien of Ainthus Adoptee Identity Rights said that the current system treats adoptees as if they are guilty of some wrongdoing and that she's been forced to liaise with agencies who simply did not care. She went on to outline that most adoptees' concerns are always very practical ones regarding medical information and access to identity information. Sinead Gibney, Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights and Equality Commission, also warned that any denial of free and unfettered access to personal information and records in this context could be in itself re-traumatising. The urgency of this bill cannot be underestimated given the age of many of the people concerned and the continuing harm done by the state's refusal to grant them access to their birth certificate. The foundational principle of this bill is to provide unconditional access to birth certificates for adopted people. This is such an incredibly important point, one which the Minister unfortunately seems to still not fully acknowledge. Earlier today, Minister, you said that the Government's Birth Information and Tracing Bill will provide access to birth, early life and care information for adopted people. Your bill does not provide unconditional access to birth certificates and any other information. Instead, the Government is imposing a mandatory information session for adopted people and adopted people only, whose natural parents have registered a no-contact preference, rather than ensuring adoptees, if they desire, have support such as counselling or medical assistance. They have a compulsory information session with a social worker and potentially social workers associated with either TUSLA or the Adoption Authority of Ireland, two bodies many adoptees understandably have no faith in. The adoptee groups and advocacy bodies who made submissions to the Children's Committee have all objected to the imposition of this barrier. The Government's Birth Information and Tracing Bill has a broader scope than this bill, but it is still loaded with restrictions, including limitations to personal information and records, the absence of mechanisms for siblings' information about each other, crucially, and significant level of discretion assigned to relevant bodies. All of these will be discussed at the committee, and I'll do everything I can to remove any and all barriers to early life information for adopted people and ensure the law is representative of a transitional justice approach. I hope the Minister and the rest of the committee, especially the Government Party members on that committee, will be willing to work with us on these issues. However, the Birth Information and Tracing Bill in its current form demonstrates that the Department is still trying to limit the information available to adoptees and is still trying to control and direct their lives. The disgraceful treatment of adopted people and survivors of mother and baby homes was demonstrated again this week, as reported in the journal.ie. Survivors seeking access to their personal information from the Minister as the data controller for the Mother and Baby Homes Commission archive were informed that they would not be given access until they nominated a GP who would receive the records first and then decide whether or not it was appropriate to pass them on. Survivors have rightly pointed out that this infantilises them and is a new bureaucratic barrier for people who have been seeking basic information about themselves for decades. Noelle Brown, an adoption rights campaigner who was born in Besborough, received one of these letters and has rightly described it as despicable and ridiculous. She also noted that this seems to be the first time that the state is concerned about adoptees and survivors of mother and baby institutions' mental health. In some cases, the department has advised survivors to file FOI requests, which just seems like another delay tactic. This cannot be disregarded as a historic practice or legacy issue. This is happening now. This is happening on the Minister's watch. It is at odds with GDPR as European legislation, and the Minister must immediately rectify the situation. While this latest issue concerns survivors of mother and baby homes, which does not include many adopted people, it is important to note that it is indicative of how the department treats people looking for their personal information. Unfortunately, this bill and others like it from opposition TDs are the only means we can guarantee that the government and state agencies will do the right thing and follow European and international law. Just with the time I have left, I think it's important to note that government after government have gotten away with disregarding survivors and their rights. Deputy Connolly already highlighted the more recent cascade of events that are in the same vein that I won't go into because she did a perfect job of it, but the statements from your department and the blanket sealing of archives back in October, the report being leaked to the media from the Commission before it was released to survivors, your statements that survivors had a copy of that report when none of them did, the deleting of the tapes by the Commission and then the miraculous recovery of them, the refusal to extend the Commission, the Commission members refusing to come before the committee, but then going to an Oxford seminar. I think the list goes on. But something that wasn't mentioned was the state apology and the kind of blame on society for that. And you mentioned in your speech, Minister, that there was a stigma and shame put on those people by the church and state. But that wasn't the nature of the state apology. And I think that's really regrettable. And just before coming here this evening, I called out to my grandmother's place, and we weren't talking about it at the time, but it was when I was coming back in, I was thinking, that was a kind of assertion that all of society thought that women should be incarcerated into these institutions for the so-called crime of getting pregnant. But back then, my grandmother was looking after pregnant women and girls in her home so they didn't have to go into those institutions. And she went on to help set up Cherish. But I was just thinking in the car on the way in, it was not all of society. And that still hasn't been corrected. You know, that's what the government said at the time when the Commission's report came out. Not to mention the fact that Commission only investigated 18 mother and baby institutions in this country, and there's another 100 plus that haven't been. And Deputy Funchen rightly highlighted and called it out that there is a huge distrust in the state in relation to these issues, understandably, based on all of the stuff that Deputy Connolly said. And I have to say that, being on the Children's Committee, and I would like to thank the chair of that committee for being just a standout chair and really appreciate it, that I'm developing those same feelings because we're looking at the burials bill now, and this is very related to this particular bill because in relation to mother and baby institutions. My understanding was that was initially called the Dignified Exhumations Bill. I don't know when the language changed to the Burials Bill, but it's very clear from the first draft of the legislation that we've done a report on that the bill only seeks to intervene where the burial is manifestly inappropriate. But no matter where your relative is buried, you have a right to find out the fate of that relative, whether they're in one of those unmarked graves or potentially anywhere else. And I just wanted to highlight that because it's relevant legislation and it creates a distrust in the state. And
many thanks, Deputy Kearns. Now, Mr. Joe O'Brien, please.